Hello, everyone. Today we are going to talk about the overview. At the previous lesson, we talked about the introduction, and I told you that you should mention the type, the title, the time frame, the legend, all these measurements, and all these things in the introduction. Then we give the overview. It is the second part of your graph description, and I can say that it is one of the most important parts. Because if your description does not have the overview, you will lose a lot of bands, especially in task achievement and coherence and cohesion criteria. Okay, so what is an overview? Overview is a word description of the graph. Word description means that you do not give any numeric data. I mean, you can give the years, right, in 1975 or in 1995, something like this. But you should avoid using numbers, specific data, information, I mean, percentages, numbers, and so on, right? Let's see how it works. The first thing that you start your overview with is a general trend. So what is a general trend? It looks like this. If you look at the picture, you see that I've connected the first and the last points of the graph, right? Of each category, I mean. For example, fish and chips. If you connect the first and the last point, you see that there was a decrease. When we move on to pizza and hamburgers, we see, again, we connect, we draw these lines in our minds, and we see that there was an increase. So this is what you should write in the first sentence. Again, even if your graph looks like this, let me draw one more picture here. For example, like this, right? If you connect the first and the last points, you see that there was a general decrease, right? Of course, we keep in mind that we had some kind of differences here. Maybe there were some fluctuations or the highest and the lowest points. But generally, if we compare only the beginning, the initial point, and the result, we see that there was a decrease. That is what you should write in the first sentence of the overview. I'm saying the first sentence, it means that there is a second sentence where we are going to mention the differences and all the other things. But for the first sentence, it's enough to give the general trend. I'm repeating this a lot of times because, a lot of students skip these points, ignore this point, neglect all these moments connected with the trend. But just believe me, if you start with the general trend, all the other things will be very simple to write about and to describe. So start with the general trend. For example, let's write the first sentence of the overview together. So overall is the best way to start your overview. You can, of course, use some phrases like generally, in general, and you will have the examples of these phrases in at the platform, I mean, in this lesson. But in general, if you use overall every time, that's okay. So overall, what can we say? What, right? The consumption of fish and chips decreased. It's better to give the degree. How? So it was around 100, and by the end of the period, it's about like 40, 39, something like this. So I can say that it decreased significantly, right? Significantly. Decreased significantly, while pizza and hamburgers, well, let's say experienced. I'm going to talk about these grammatical structures, by the way, a bit later. Experienced an upward trend. So this is the first sentence of our overview. The consumption of fish and chips decreased significantly, while pizza and hamburgers experienced an upward trend. It's a very important moment in the overview as well as in main bodies. Actually, we are going to talk about this in details at the next lesson. I mean, grouping, right? It's very important to group the information because there is no point to write separately about pizza and hamburgers because they have the same trend, the similar trend, right? So you can combine them in one sentence. While pizza and hamburgers experience an upward trend. So this is our first sentence. I guess everything is clear. Let's go further. But of course, it's not enough. As I've told you before, right? If you had the graph like this, you cannot just say about the first and the last point and skip all this part. It will be like a bit unfair, let's say. And for this reason, we add some more points. And I mean, you should write differences from the general trend. I would recommend you write one difference, which is really obvious. Like you look at the picture and you see that you should mention it. Maybe the highest point, maybe the lowest point, maybe some differences. I mean, one category was leading at the beginning, but it sharply lost its position and gave way to some other categories, right? It is also obvious when you look at this picture, just when you look at it as a picture, right? Not as a graph or something like this, but just a picture. And the first thing that comes to your mind after the general trend, what is this? So this is the difference from the general trend. For example, here, what do we see here? We do not see any really high and really low points, right? There is nothing like this or this. It's more or less stable. I mean, the trends, these lines. So what can we mention here? The first thing that I saw when I looked at this graph as a picture, I noticed that the category of fish and chips had the highest numbers at the beginning, right, in the first decade from 1975 to 1985, and then it lost its position dramatically, I can even say. And as for hamburgers and pizza, we see that again, their position, their number was the lowest at the beginning, while it was the highest by the end of the period. But of course, I cannot be so detailed and I cannot write so many words in my overview because it's just an overview. And I should give some general information, right? That's why I can write something like this. Okay, let me move it maybe a bit. Okay, I want to continue writing here. So overall, the consumption of fish and chips decreased significantly. It was our first sentence, our general trend, while pizza and hamburgers experienced an upward trend, right? Oh, sorry for spelling mistake. Moreover, I can say be careful with the choice of linking words and phrases, by the way, because sometimes you will use moreover, sometimes you will use however, sometimes you will use in addition, depending on what you're going to write. Maybe in contrast, right? In contrast. Here, I want to strengthen the idea that there was like decrease and increase, and moreover, it was not just a decrease and increase. It was completely like complete change in the positions of these categories, right? So, moreover, fish and chips, let's say, had the highest, we cannot say percentages, figure. Yeah, figure will be the most neutral word in this situation. Had the highest figure at the beginning of the period, sorry, at the beginning of the period. But it was overtaken, right? Or maybe you can say surpassed, also a good one. But it was overtaken by the other two categories. I do not need to mention them again because I have already done it before, pizza and hamburgers. It is clear, right? By the other two types of fast food. And it's a good way to paraphrase, by the way. In the final years of the survey, right? You can say like this. So let me check. Overall, the consumption of chips, this is the first sentence. Moreover, fish and chips had the highest figure at the beginning of the period, but it was overtaken by the other two types of fast food in the final years of survey. So, in my opinion, everything is perfect in terms of the content and so on. Of course, maybe you can improve it lexically and grammatically. For example, instead of writing decreased significantly, you can use a bit more advanced words like declined markedly, right? And maybe this overview will go for 8.0 band and so on. But again, it depends. Sometimes it's better to keep it simple than to overcomplicate it. That's it about the overview. I would like to give you some more examples. If you look at this graph, it's a bar chart. It shows the divorce rates in Finland and Sweden. So what is the general trend? Just look and think about it. As for Finland, there was an increase. It was very slight. And as for Sweden, there was a decrease. And again, it was quite slight. So this is what you can write. There was a slight increase. There was a minor upward trend or downward trend like this. Okay, this is a general trend. What is the difference from the general trend? Actually, here you can have various options. Some of my students, when I gave them this graph, they mentioned this point that in 2012, the difference was the biggest. Why not? You can say like this. The other students mentioned the fact as we, as in the previous graph, right? Mentioned the fact that Sweden had the highest percentage at the beginning of the period, while it lost its position by the end of the period. It was overtaken by Finland. Something like this will also work. So there is no correct or incorrect overview. There can be just logical overview. Because for some people, it's more important to mention this point. For other people, it's more important to mention like the differences in the categories. That is okay. But the difference from the general trend should be something obvious, right? Not just some slight minor changes, which are not really important, but something which you really see, something noticeable and obvious. Okay, here we talked about the dynamic graphs. By dynamic graphs, I mean that here we have the time frame and we have some changes during this time. And the same here, right? We have the time frame from 1975 to 2000, and we have some changes during this time. And in this case, we use the vocabulary like increase, decrease, decline, drop, rise, fall, and so on. And you add some adjectives and adverbs like dramatically, slightly, minor changes, and so on. But sometimes we can have the static graphs. They look like this. They are called static because we have some, let's say, okay, static information. It's not moving anywhere. We do not see any changes. We just see different categories in different, in this case, countries. So we have 5 categories in France and UK. And we cannot use the words like increase, decrease. Nothing increased, nothing decreased, because everything happened in 1 year. It's just the static data in 1 year, right? In this case, you will not talk about the general trend, of course, because there is no general trend. And the structure will be a bit different, but the logic is the same. In the static graphs, you talk about the lowest and the highest points, and you compare the groups. Grouping, of course, works here because we have a lot of categories. For example, again, you look at this graph and you see that the most, it shows the expenditure, right, of France and the UK on different types of consumer goods. And you see that the biggest amounts of money were spent on cars, computers, and books, mostly, right? However, in the UK, we also see that people spend a lot of money on cameras. However, in France, like on the other hand, in France, it was the lowest expenditure out of all. So this is what you write here. For example, your overview in this case can look like this. Okay, overall, right, again, in both countries, the highest expenditure was on cars, computers, and books, right? As I've told you. And then I can mention that in the UK, spending on cameras, yeah, was also relatively high. It's better to avoid using also, but maybe I will find a way to paraphrase it later. Relatively high, whereas in France, this category, let's paraphrase a bit. For example, accounted for the lowest expenditure. And by contrast, I'm going to write about the perfume because I haven't mentioned it yet. Perfume recorded rate, for example, comparatively low spending in both countries. If we think about some ways to paraphrase, maybe I could write something like overall cars, computers, and books accounted for the largest proportions of consumer spending in both countries. In the UK, cameras represented a relatively high level of expenditure, or also represent a relatively high level of expenditure, while this category had the lowest figure in France. By contrast, perfume remained among the least purchased items in both nations. I just tried to paraphrase, right? In this case, yeah, you could use it like this. But, you know, before all these lexical things, I mean, all this good vocabulary and grammar, which you want to be of an advanced level. Of course, it's a very good thing to do. But before doing all of this, my recommendation to you is to think about the meaning, the content, right? About what you're going to write. You should convey some precise meanings. You should follow the structure. You should follow the logic of the overview. And when you learn how to do this, only after this, I would recommend you to think about the grammar, about the vocabulary and so on. Even now, while I was writing, first I just gave the skeleton, the structure of my answer, and then I thought about the possible ways to paraphrase, right? And of course, like step by step, when you start practicing and when you write more and more examples of introductions and overviews, your vocabulary and your grammar is going to improve. Okay, I guess everything is clear in terms of all this structure, logic, and all these things. And now let's get to some grammatical structures that you can use. And actually, there are 3 types of structures that I usually give my students, and they look like this. Firstly, you give the subject, then you give the verb, then you give the adverb. It's like what happened, like what, and then what happened with this, and then you give how it happened. For example, what? The number of people. What happened to this number of people? It increased. How? Significantly over the period. It is the simplest structure, but you know, it sounds really academic, and this is a structure that examiners prefer to some more complicated structures. And you can use these structures quite frequently in your descriptions. The percentage of something decreased steadily between this and this year. The number of people dropped significantly over the period. Things like this. Pay attention. First, we write what, then what happened, and only then how it happened. A very common mistake of a lot of people is to use another structure, like the number of people significantly increased or dramatically decreased. It's better in academic writing, it's better to put the verb and to use the adverb afterwards. Okay, the second thing, the second possible structure. So the same sentence can be paraphrased with the use of there plus to be plus adjective plus noun. I mean, there was, there were, maybe there is, there are, maybe there is likely to be. So it depends on the tense that you're going to have in your report, right? For example, if we use the past tense, there was a significant increase in the number of people over the period. Pay attention. I'm paraphrasing the same sentence, right? I'm changing nothing, just the structure. I start with there was, then what? An increase. What kind of increase? As significant. And the adverb is changed to the adjective because here we had the verb, and that is why we have the adverb. Here we have the noun, that's why we have the adjective. And the most important thing here is the preposition which is used. There was a significant increase in the number of people. And the third structure that you can use looks like this. You start with the subject again, then you use the words like see, show, experience, then you give the adjective, noun, and trend. And you see that this structure is quite complicated. I do not really recommend you use it very often. Maybe you can use it once in your report just to vary the structures because it's really important, right? You're going to talk about different categories a lot of times in overview and then in main body. And of course, it will be a good idea to vary your structures, but do not overuse the third structure. You can use the first structure more than once. You can use the second structure more than once, but regarding the third structure, it's better to use it once. Do not overuse it, right? Again. So the number of people experienced a significant increase between 2010 and 2020. So the subject, the number of people. Then you use some of these verbs, experienced in this case. What? An increase. What kind of? A significant increase between this and this period. Or the number of people showed what kind of trend? An upward trend between 2010 and 2020. So take all these structures into account and try to use them all in your overviews. Of course, in your main bodies as well, but even in the overviews, you can use some of them. You will have the tables regarding these structures at the platform, and you will have more examples there. And I guess that it will be clear and useful.